Hello and welcome to Straight Onto Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at StraightOnToDisneyPod, and you can email me your thoughts at straightontodisneypod@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to this week's Straight Onto Disney, where we're going to be chatting about The Jungle Book. So we're moving on throughout the 60s, and this is the last Disney film to be released in the 60s. So we'll have the poll pop up at the end of the week, and you can tell me what films you prefer from Sleeping Beauty through to Jungle Book. As always, the poll is already up on YouTube, and I'll throw one on the Instagram. So just to get a really good idea of where people's thoughts are with the films of the 60s. And I'm going to throw Sleeping Beauty in there because Sleeping Beauty wouldn't fit on the poll for the 50s. And to be fair, it's kind of very much rooted within 60s. And if you've been listening to the pod, you understand why I'm saying that. So yeah, that's what the poll's going to be this month. And yeah, then we're going to dive straight head on into the 70s with the Aristocats next week. But yeah, Jungle Book. There isn't a lot of mousekeeping this week, so I'm going to move swiftly on to production history. The Jungle Book was directed by Wolfgang Reitman, produced by Walt Disney. The story was by Larry Clemens, Ralph Wright, Ken Anderson, and Vance Jerry. The film stars Phil Harris, Sebastian Cabot, Lewis Prime, George Sanders, and Sterling Holloway. Music was by George Bruns. The film was edited by Tom Acosta and Norman Carlyle. Studios was Walt Disney Productions. Its distributor was Buena Vista Distribution. The film was released October 18th, 1967, with a runtime of 78 minutes. The film was released in English. The film had a budget of $4 million, and its gross revenue was $378 million. As a lot of fans of Disney probably already know, that Jungle Book is noted for being the last Disney film that was approved by Walt Disney, who died during production, along with the Aristocats, which, to be fair, you never really hear getting told that he died within Aristocats. Mostly the Jungle Book that you hear them talk about this. However, Disney still did work within a lot of the films that were released within the 70s and in earlier stages, which is going to be really interesting to dive in and know about, because personally I had no idea that Disney still had such an impact and was involved with these projects before his death. And obviously The Jungle Book would be the first Disney film to be released after his death. So it's a really interesting, unique piece of time history here, The Jungle Book, in that it is the first film that Disney was not around to see the final project of. And it's really interesting to see that a lot of the marketing surrounding this film does tend to fall on Baloo and King Louie, which I find quite interesting. And we'll dive more into that in the legacy section, which is going to be interesting. Jungle Book stands as one of the most popular Disney movies of all time. As I've already mentioned, it has such a big legacy that we're going to be touching upon later on in the episode. Don't think this episode's going to be as long as Sleeping Beauty, but we'll see. Potentially. I want to be like you, hoo hoo. They say to the Sleeping Beauty episode. I am so sorry that is an hour and 40, almost 2 hours long. I almost put everybody to sleep with that episode, but it's just so fascinating. I'm now whomping on about Sleeping Beauty again. Also, before I forget, thank you to everyone who's been watching Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty on YouTube. It's now up so many views, so thank you all for listening for that. And I should probably mention that later on in the episode, but it's just came to mind now, so thank you. What is interesting here is that the success and popularity within the Jungle Book is on par to that of The Lion King, and The Lion King's popularity, and especially when we get to that film in the 90s, it's going to be really interesting to compare that to here with the Jungle Book. Would be really interesting to see how it's done compared to both of them. And it's had such a great influence, this film, on so many of this film's had so much influence upon those who have come up within the animation world and are now leading figures within, such as Brad Bird of The Incredibles and Ratatouille and Andreas Deyer. However, as we all know, Disney didn't have the success. As we all know, Disney's success did dip a bit within the next few decades, till that of The Little Mermaid in 1989, which is when the Renaissance began. And it's going to be so interesting to dive in to the Renaissance and see how much of the Renaissance did actually save Disney within that period, which is going to be so interesting, fascinating to get to. However, what is noted within this, and it's less like Jungle Book, is that Disney still did have some success. Disney did have. What is noted here is that Disney did still have successes after the Jungle Book, with that being The Rescuers and The Great Mouse Detective. But it's interesting to see here that the Jungle Book was really the biggest success that they had till at least The Little Mermaid. So, and we'll dive more into these later on in the legacy section, but obviously you will all know that Disney released The Jungle Book 2, and it had the live action film starring Bill Murray and Idris Elba and a whole host of characters, and directed by Jon Favreau. So we'll be definitely chatting more about Jon Favreau in a good few years on the podcast when we get to the films. When we get to the live action films, and obviously Marvel and Star Wars, so it's going to be really interesting to chat about him there. And obviously, he also directed the live action Lion King, so it's going to be interesting to see there and compare these films, because I plan to do that in the episodes on the live action films. If that's something you think you want to see now, let me know in the comments. Are you happy with the release schedule of doing the animated first? It's just interesting, and just genuinely want to know. So the Jungle Book first caught Disney's eye within the 1930s, that being the Rudyard Kipling's short story, and it is far vastly different to the original source material. And the live action one is far more darker and far more like the original source material than the animated film. And I think it's really good that Disney did that to stand it out its ground, in that this is a different retelling and kind of cater it towards its primary target audience, that being young kids. So it's totally understandable why they would do so. In April of 1962, after 10 years of negotiations with the estate of the late director Alexander Korda, who had directed live action The Jungle Book short for television and versions of the tales within 1942, Walt finally acquired the rights to do his adaptation of The Jungle Book. However, production would not start till 1963, because obviously the studio were nearing completion of The Sword and the Stone, and obviously that was their priority. At the time, Bill Peet said that we, as in the animation department, were far more interested in telling unique stories with animal characters, and he claimed that The Jungle Book would be the perfect next film to be made by the Disney company, and Disney agreed. However, after the disappointing reactions to that of The Sword of the Stone, he decided to become more involved in the story than he had been in the past few films, and thus Walt's Walt's focus within the animated films was brought back with this film, and it's wonderful to see that at least the last film before his death, he was so fascinated and interested in telling this unique story. And obviously, as we've chatted, well, as I've chatted about on the podcast before, within the Sleeping Beauty episode and 100 More Dalmatians to an extent, Walt's focus was on the parks, on everything that wasn't animated. And it was the Jungle Book that brought him back into being so invested in what he had created, the animation studio that he had built up from Mickey Mouse. He had built this company from there, and it's really nice to know that before he did die, that he did come back to the animated side, and he did find his passion and love for animated films once again. Pete did decide to take a more darker and sinister approach to the book, as is within the original source material, and wrote a script for it. And that was done without very little supervision. He had done so with 101 Dalmatians and The Sword and the Stone, with character designs as well as the idea for the song, The Bare Necessities. The original story tells about the struggle between animals and man. Since the novel is very episodic in its nature, with Mowgli going back and forth from the jungle and the man village, Pete made the story far much more straightforward, feeling that Mowgli returning to the man village should be the film's ending, and I 100% agree. It's taking a really strong creative decision here, and that's making the far more implications and struggle of the film in the battle between Mowgli and Shere Khan far more dramatic and interesting. Following suggestions, Pete created two original characters. The human girl, for which Mowgli falls in love with, as the animators considered the falling in love would be the best motive for Mowgli to leave the jungle. And Louie, king of the monkeys. Louie was a less comical character, enslaving, much like in the live-action adaptation, Mowgli, trying to get the boy to teach him to make fire. The orangutan would also show a plot point borrowed from the second Jungle Book, Gold and Jewels under his ruins. After Mowgli got to the man village, a poacher would drag the boy back to the ruins in search of the treasure. However, disappointed by the reception of The Sword and the Stone, Disney was determined to be more involved within the story than he had been in the past two films that were written by Pete, with his nephew Roy E. Disney saying that he certainly influenced everything about with the Jungle Book. He obviously got hooked on the jungle and the characters that lived through them. Disney soon became critical of Pete's original treatment and how the film turned out, as he felt it was too dark, and clearly it's far darker than what was originally intended. And ultimately, as I've said previously, this film is intended for a target audience of young audiences, and having it this dark and cruel. And yes, Disney has never strayed away from being dark and cruel. Bambi, I'm thinking of you. But for what they wanted to do with this story, and it's clearly evident here that there was a power struggle between, well, not a power struggle, but even a creative struggle between Pete and Disney here of what they wanted the story to be. And ultimately, you can understand where it's coming from, because this is the Disney company. And you can understand from a point of view where Pete would be like, I want to do this, whereas Disney was thinking more about in line with younger audiences, which are the target audience of this film. And ultimately, Pete's originality and version of what this film could have been probably influenced a lot of the live-action Jungle Book. What is interesting, though, is that Pete left the Disney studio in January 1964. So Pete will be another one we will be discussing in Behind the Mouse, new segment coming soon, because this is the last time that Pete is involved within a Disney production, to my knowledge. Disney then assigned Larry Clemens to be his new writer and one of the 4 storymen for the film, giving Clemens a copy of Kipling's book and telling him, the first thing I want you to do is not read. This is the quote that I think everybody knows about the Jungle Book when it comes to its production history is, I'm going to give you the book. The first thing I want you to do is not read it. It's clearly the summary of this film. Clemens, however, still would look at the novel and thought it was too disjointed and without continuity, needed adaptation to fit a film script. It very much fit more for TV. Disney said to focus on doing the storyline more straight. Let's do the meat of the picture. Let's establish the characters. Let's have fun with it. Although much of Bill Pete's work was discarded, the personalities of the characters remained in the final film. This was because Disney felt that the story should be kept simpler and the characters should drive the story. This film is character driven, whereas more plot driven in terms of more Sword in the Stone. I feel is far more plot driven than it is character driven. And if I'm being honest, I really prefer character driven stories because they're far more interesting and unique. And therefore, Jungle's narrative, the more Jungle, I can't even pronounce that. Therefore, the emphasis should be within the responsibilities of growing on. The emphasis of the film should be on about responsibility and growing up, which is what young audiences that could attach towards, and especially for those young audiences that had started growing up from the years of the original films, it was allowing them to marry up to how their fans were growing up now and the new fans that were coming in within the films. Disney took an active role in story meetings, getting out each role and helping to explore the emotions of the characters, help create gags and develop the emotional sequences. Clements would write a rough script with an outline with an outline for most. Read that again. Clements would write a rough script with an outline for most sequences. The story artists then discussed how to do the scenes and how to fill the scenes, including the comedic gags to employ. The script also tried to incorporate how the voice of each of the characters would sound and therefore fit with each other and how they would interact. The Jungle Book also marks the last animated film from the company to have Disney's personal touches before his death in December 15th, 1966. And yeah, it's another one we'll be touching on in, obviously, Behind the Mouse. I don't know if I really need to do a Behind the Mouse on Walt Disney, considering that's what we're doing here, but maybe might start with Walt Disney and we'll work throughout some of the other people who aren't now part of these films, who were just a part of the history that we don't really talk about, which is really cool and interesting. Many familiar voices inspired the animators in their creation of the characters and helped them shape their personalities. The use of familiar voices for key characters was a rarity in Disney's past films. The staff was shocked to hear that a wisecracking comedian, Phil Harris, was going to be in a Kipling film. Disney suggested Harris after meeting him at a party. Harris improvised most of his lines as he considered the scripted lines don't feel natural. After Harris was cast, Disneyland Records president Jimmy Johnson suggested Disney to get Louis Primer as King Louis, as he felt that Louis would be great as foil. Walt also cast other prominent actors such as George Sanders as Shere Khan and Sebastian Croft as Bagheera. Additionally, he cast regular Disney voices such as Sterling Holloway as Car, J. Pat O'Malley as Colonel Huffy, and Buzzy the Vulture, and Velma Felton as Huffy's wife. This was her last film before she died. David Bailey was originally cast as Mowgli, but his voice changed during production, leading to Bailey no longer fitting the young innocence of Mowgli's character, which the producers were aiming for. Thus, director Wolfgang Reifman cast his young son Bruce Reifman, who had just voiced Christopher Robin in Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree. The animators shot footage of Bruce as a guide for the character's performance. Child actress Dadine Khan was going around singing in the studio when composers, the Sherman Brothers, asked her to record a demo of Shanti's song My Own Home. Car's performance impressed Disney enough for him to cast her as Shanti. Disney created new characters in the form of the Vultures, who bear a physical and vocal presence to the Beatles, including the signature mop-top haircuts. It was also planned to have the members of the band in both voice characters and sing the song. That's what friends are for. However, scheduling conflicts added to John Lennon reacting badly to the idea, reacting badly, which led to the idea being discarded. The casting of the Vultures still brought a British invasion musically. British invasion musician Chad Stewart of the duo Chad and Jeremy. In early drafts of the scene, the Vultures had a near sighting. Vultures. The Vultures had a near-sighted rhinoceros friend named Rocky, who was to be voiced by Frank Fontaine. However, Walt decided to cut the character for feeling that the film had already enough characters and also enough action with both the monkeys and the vultures. So we could have had a film with the Disney film with the Beatles, and I have no idea. Like, I had no idea that was ever considered, and I don't think anybody ever talks about the fact that the Beatles were almost in the Jungle Book, which is crazy to think about. And ultimately, why doesn't anybody talk about this more? Maybe it's just me that I've never heard about this and I'm a bit too young, unfortunately, to ever have thought about this. But wow, the Beatles were going to be in the Jungle Book, and it's kind of sad that they didn't, because that would have been really cool for this film. While many of the later Disney feature films had animators being responsible for single characters, in The Jungle Book, the animators were in charge of the whole sequences. Since many have characters interacting with one another, the animation was done using xerography, exography. The animation of the film was done using exography, with characters design led by Ken Anderson, employing rough artistic edges in contrast to the round animals seen in productions such as Dumbo. Anderson also decided to make Shere Khan resemble his voice actor George Sanders. Backgrounds were also painted with exception of the waterfall, mostly consisting of footage of the Angel Falls. And sometimes scenes were used both foreground and bottom to create a notion of depth. Following one of Reifman's trademarks of reusing animation of his previous films, the wolf cubs are based on dogs from 101 Dalmatians. Also, the chase in King Louis's Ruins is reused from the chase scene in the Wind of the Willows segment of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. I never knew that. That's cool. Maybe I've just never paid much attention to that. Animator Milt Kahr based Bagheera and Shere Khan's movements on live-action felines, which he saw two Disney productions, A Tiger Walks and The Jungle Cat episode of True Life Adventures. Baloo was also based on footage of bears, even incorporating the animal's penchant for scratching. Since Car has no limbs, its design received received big expressive eyes, and parts of Car's body did the action that normally would be done with hands. The monkeys dancing during I Wanna Be Like You was partially inspired by in a performance of Louis Primer did with his band of Disney's soundstage to convince Walt Disney to cast him. The film's overture was originally written for the 1964 New York's World Fair as one of the musical tracks for the International Gardens miniatures display for the Ford Pavilion, where it was titled Serengeti Serenade. Longtime Disney collaborator Terry Gilliski was brought on to write the songs for the film. Gilliski delivered several complete songs, but Walt Disney felt that his efforts were too dark. The Sherman Brothers were brought on in to do a complete rewrite on the condition that they did not read Rudyard Kipling's book. The only piece of Gurrick's work which survived is in the final film was his upbeat tone, The Bare Necessities, which was liked by the rest of the film crew. The song Trust in Me is based on a song entitled Land of Sand, which had been written by the Sherman Brothers for but not used in Mary Poppins. Part of Bare Necessities was remixed for the theme song of its short-lived 1990s TV spin-off Jungle Cubs. In the scene where Bagheera, the vultures and Mowgli believe that Baloo is dead, as well as Bagheera's funerals Baloo. Paul J. Smith's organ score from Walt Disney's first film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is heard from the scene where the seven dwarfs mourn Snow White on her bed before the prince arrives to waken her. We're Your Friends was originally conceived as a rock and roll song, sung by the quartet of vultures and the original character, Rocky the Rhino. The vultures were even designed to based on the Beatles, as I've mentioned beforehand. There were many deleted songs that did not feature within the final film. These include These include Brothers All, which would have been the opening, the song of the Seanids, which would have been sung by the Wolfpack, Monkey See, Monkey Do by the Monkeys, I Knew I Belonged to Her, Mowgli, In a Day's Work by Baloo and Bagheera, and the Mighty Hunters, Shere Khan and Buldeo the Hunter. I have no idea who that character is. Buldeo the Hunter? The Hunter? Buldeo the Hunter? Tell me who you think that is in the comments. The film has had an incredibly great reception and is scored high on Rotten Tomatoes as always. The film, interestingly, has incredibly harsh criticism did however come from Rudyard Kipling's own daughter, Elsie Kipling Barnbridge, who was still alive at the time of Disney's film was released. It's really interesting to see here that The Jungle Book has such a really interesting and unique production history, in that this film was the last film that Disney really was involved with it. And it's beautiful to see that Disney's passion for animation films was reignited with this film before his untimely death in December that year of Walt Disney's death. And it's really interesting to see that this was the film he was so invested in and how much of a legacy this film has. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But it's so interesting and unique to see here that this film really brought Disney's spark for animated films, and who knows what Disney would have done had he lived on and had been a much more bigger part of the Aristocats and films that come after it. And it's a really good benchmark for where Disney is as the company. So, we've chatted about the production history. Shall we have a chat about the film? Mowgli is found in a basket as a baby in the deep jungle of Madhya Pradesh. Mowgli is found in a basket as a baby in the deep jungles of Madhya Pradesh, India, by Bagheera, the Black Panther. He promptly takes him to an Indian wolf who has just had Mowgli is found in a basket as a baby in the deep jungle of India by Bagheera the Black Panther. He promptly takes him to an Indian wolf who has just had cubs. She raises him alongside her own cubs, and Mowgli soon becomes well acquainted with jungle life. 10 years later, Mowgli visits the wolves and gets his face licked eagerly on his arrival. While Bagheera and the wolves are with how content the boy is with jungle life, they are also aware that he may have to return to his own kind eventually. That moment comes one night when the wolf pack elders gather at Council Rock, having warned that Shere Khan, a man-hating Bengal tiger, has returned to their part of the jungle. They realize that Mowgli must leave their pack, as the tiger is notorious for his prejudice towards humans, due to the fear of guns and fire, and will kill the boy and anyone who tries to protect him. Bagheera steps in, offering to take him to a man village where he will find refuge from the tiger, to which the council agrees. What? It takes. Sorry, I'm just gonna stand by. They leave. There, you go back in center. They leave that very night, but Mowgli determined to stay in the jungle, as he is against the idea of disabandoning the only home he's ever known for a village of strangers, being unsure of his own humanity as a result of never meeting other humans, and is certain that he can take on Shere Khan. They spend the night on a large tree where they encounter Kaa, a python who hypnotizes Mowgli and wraps him in his coils in order to eat him. Bagheera stops him, and he and Mowgli go to sleep. The next morning, Mowgli tries to join the Indian elephants patrol led by Colonel Hathi. Bagheera finds Mowgli and they argue. Mowgli runs away from Bagheera. The boy soon meets up with the fun-loving Bear Baloo, who shows Mowgli the fun of having a carefree life, and promises not to take him to the man village, as Baloo believes that the villagers there will ruin the boy and make a man out of him. We're not at Mulan yet. Mowgli now wants to stay in the jungle more than ever before. Before long, Mowgli is caught by a gang of monkeys who takes him to their leader, King Louie, the orangutan, who makes a deal with Mowgli that if he tells him the secret of making fire like a human, then he will make it so he can stay in the jungle. However, since he has not been raised by humans, Mowgli doesn't know how to make a fire. Bagheera and Baloo arrive at the palace unseen and try to plan a way to break Mowgli out. But the catchy beat of the song distracts Baloo, and he wanders off dancing. Soon, however, he appears dressed in banana skins and coconut shells, posing as a female orangutan, which fools the king. But soon, Baloo's disguise is revealed, and there begins a mad chase between the monkeys and Baloo and Bagheera over Mowgli. The king accidentally knocks down a pillar and holds up the temple the best he can until he struggles. When Baloo begins to tickle him frantically under the arms, the monkeys manage to stop Baloo's tickling, but ends up bouncing the king all the way to the other pillar instead of causing the temple to collapse in a rumble. Mowgli is rescued from King Louie by Bagheera and Baloo. Later that night, Bagheera explains to Baloo that the jungle isn't safe when Shere Khan is around. That night, while Baloo points out Mowgli is still a child and couldn't possibly be a threat, Bagheera points out that is exactly why Shere Khan would attack him. Baloo admits that he cares about Mowgli and would hate for anything to happen to him. Bagheera tells him if he does care, he'll take Mowgli back to the village, as he would listen to him only. As morning arrives, Baloo reluctantly explains to Mowgli that the man village is the best place for him, but Mowgli accuses him of breaking his promise and runs away into the deepest part of the jungle. Bagheera, after Baloo explains to him, then finds the elephants patrol and tells Hathi of Mowgli running away, and Shere Khan himself overhearing. Hathi then organizes a special search mission for all of the herd. Later, Kaa hypnotizes Mowgli into a deep and peaceful sleep and traps him in his coils, again, after tricking him that Mowgli can trust him. Thanks to the intervention of Shere Khan, Mowgli escapes before Kaa can eat him. Suddenly, Mowgli encounters a group of solemn vultures, who closely resemble the beetles, and they say they'll be his friends. The vultures argue and continually sidetrack Mowgli with their pointless arguing. When they see how sad Mowgli is, they ask if he's alone, and he doesn't have anyone. He admits this. They explain they are also alone, as no one likes them, but they are still animals with feelings. They try to cheer him up with a song. That's what friends are for. Shere Khan appears shortly afterwards and challenges Mowgli in a fight. He tries to fight back, but soon loses his nerve upon seeing how truly frightening the tiger is. Baloo then rushes to the rescue, but is knocked unconscious, and Mowgli, at the advice of the vultures, that Shere Khan is scared of fire, as a flaming branch onto Shere Khan's tail in order to get rid of the ruthless tiger. Baloo then wakes up, and he and Bagheera take Mowgli to the edge of the man village, but Mowgli is still hesitant to go in. His mind soon changes when a young girl from the village comes down by the riverside to fetch water and sings. After noticing the boy, she accidentally drops the water pot, and Mowgli retrieves it for her and follows her into the man village. Realizing that the man village may not be as bad as he first thought, Mowgli chooses to stay there. While initially saddened by this, Baloo and Bagheera then accept Mowgli's departure and head back into the jungle together. So that is the film of the Jungle Book, and it's a really unique and interesting film, and far different from the original tale that Rudyard Kipling first originally drafted in its darker, more grittier nature. And obviously, we will see when I chat about the live action one, which is far more like the original film. But it's going to be a really interesting thing to see how different these two films are. And ultimately, I think this film is a beautiful film. I think it's done really well with care. It's not one of my favourites, if I'm going to be truthfully honest, but it's a beautiful film, The Jungle Book, and obviously the songs are so catchy. Like, I'm not going to throw on The Jungle Book like I want to, because I just never grew up with it, whereas with some of the other ones, I loved it, because they're kind of my thing. But The Jungle Book is a beautiful film, and yeah. Shall we chat about the legacy? So, what exactly is the legacy of The Jungle Book? Well, we can first of all start with the fact that The Jungle Book had a sequel, The Jungle Book 2, which we will dive into on the podcast later on not later on in the year, but later on down the line. And obviously, The Jungle Book was also had its live action in 2016, which is 10 years this year. Which is crazy to think that film's now 10-year-old, directed by Jon Favreau, and as I mentioned at the start of this video, there's a lot to chat about when it comes to that live action film, and we will do so when we chat about the live action films later on down the line. So Mowgli did used to make regular meet and greets within the parks. However, he did become extremely rare after 1999. A statue of Mowgli and Baloo can be found in Disney's Pop Century Resort. At Disney's Animal Kingdom, Mowgli appeared in the short-lived show Journey into the Jungle Book. And obviously that's all at Walt Disney World in Florida. Mowgli appears in the Bubble montage at Disney's Hollywood Studios version of Fantasmic. And obviously also during the Bare Necessities snippet in Happily Ever After. Over in Tokyo Disney, Mowgli appeared in Jubilations in Tokyo Disneyland in the parade. Mowgli can be found on the Jungle Book themed float atop the cat the snake in his coils. Mowgli appears in Hong Kong Disneyland's It's a Small World attraction alongside Baloo as dolls. So, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, there's far much more legacy when it comes to its animal characters than it does with Mowgli itself. And that's why when it comes to the parks, there's barely any Mowgli there. However, Baloo is a much more eatable meet and greet character. And one of the things before we chatted about his parks legacy is Baloo was a playable character in Disney Infinity, in Disney Infinity 3.0, which ended 10 years ago this month. So it's been 10 years since Disney ended Disney Infinity, and I do want to do an episode about that coming up soon because it is the 10th anniversary since the game ended, and that was my childhood. So it's going to be fun to chat about that at some point in the next month. Maybe the episode before we do San Diego Comic-Con stuff. Who knows? We'll see how we dive into that as well. I haven't decided what I'm going to do for that one. That episode that sits in the middle of what's going on that week. Baloo also meets alongside King Louie in the Asia side of Disney's Animal Kingdom. In the Tokyo Disney edition of Fantasmic, Baloo appears in the jungle sequence as a large inflatable figure on one of the large barges. Baloo sometimes appears at Tokyo Disneyland as a meetable character as well. Alongside that, a lot of the same legacy stands for King Louie and Bagheera. Well, not as much Bagheera as well as Shere Khan. They do pop up time and time and again in the parks. They don't actually appear within the Kingdom Hearts games, which is interesting to note. They do appear within Disney Magic Kingdoms, and that's kind of it because they don't appear in Once Upon a Time. I've mentioned the live actions. The Jungle Book characters appear within House of the Mouse, as always, as all the characters seemingly do within Disney canon to a certain point when House of the Mouse was on. They also appear within Once Upon a Studio, and Baloo and Mowgli do sing along at the end with all the other characters, and that's really it for its legacy. So there's no real rides when it comes to the Jungle Book, which I find incredibly interesting considering how much of a success this film was. and how much of an impact it has within the Disney Animal Kingdom, and that it really has this big impact. But what we can see from this week's episode is that The Jungle Book had such a big impact within the Disney canon. It was a major milestone within Disney at the time of the 60s, and is really a representation of where the 60s were going in terms of its rights, and really showing that young adults could be more grown up and the responsibilities that young adults had. And ultimately, we can see from this week's episode is that The Jungle Book is so relatively done so well because of its. It's done so well because we didn't read the book. That's the main thing from this episode, is that we don't always have to do a complete adaptation of the film, but adaptation of its original source. And yes, I would still encourage writers to read the original sources because it's always cool to do so, but we don't have to do a complete adaptation where it's the same dark, because this film is intended for young audiences, and I don't think the original Rudyard Kipling novel is really suitable for young audiences, and that's why I find it a really strong markable decision from Disney, is that this film has to be vastly different to the original source material. And it's ultimately such a legacy, such an interesting and fascinating place within Disney history that ultimately has let this film be what it is today. So that's where I'm going to wrap this week's podcast up. As always, you can follow me on Instagram at straightuntildisneypod, and you can email me your thoughts at straightuntildisneypod@gmail.com. Like and subscribe as always. Go follow on Spotify if you want to listen. You can follow on Spotify and Apple. They're linked in the YouTube notes. You can follow on Instagram. You can follow me because I have a link tree with everything where you can find where the podcast is on the Instagram. You can leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Do you like The Jungle Book? What's your thoughts on the film? Tell me in the comments below. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and email me your thoughts. Would be lovely. Be interesting. Nice to get some more guests on at some point, hopefully. And there's a few things I'm gonna try and get sorted soon before the podcast. So as always, like and comment and share it to a friend. Let your dog watch. Share it to your friend. Share it to your dog. Get as much people on. And thank you all for those who have been new subscribers, new listeners, and getting the viewing counts of some of these films up. Has been really fun and cool to see, and it's been really fun to see that it's growing across. So it's a really fun time to be on the podcast. So stay tuned, because we are going to be diving into San Diego Comic-Con. And obviously, if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, the Instagram, you want to see that I've started doing the X-Men 97 Season 2 weekly reacts to the episode. So that will be coming next Wednesday when episode 4 drops. You can go see the reaction to episode 1 through 3 now on the YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels. So go and have a check on them, because it's pretty cool. So yeah, that's where I'm going to wrap this week's episode up. Thank you all for watching, Thank you all for listening over on Spotify. And bye!